The drill instructor handed him the rifle with a smirk that should have been a warning. Private Daniel Hayes took it without question, just like he'd been trained to do. He was 68 years old, the oldest recruit in the history of that Marine Corps training facility, and every single person on that range expected him to fail. What they didn't know was that this white-haired man in the red jacket they'd seen shuffling around base had already spent 40 years as a Marine sniper before an administrative error forced him to go through basic training all over again. When he lined up at the 200-yard mark and the other recruits started laughing, when he raised that weapon and felt the weight all wrong in his hands, when he pulled the trigger and heard the pop instead of the crack, he didn't flinch. He just kept firing. And what happened next made every Marine on that base stand at attention. Daniel Hayes had joined the Marines in 1975, fresh out of high school, with nothing but a duffel bag and a father's disappointed stare following him to the recruitment office. He'd served in conflicts most people had forgotten, earned medals he kept in a shoebox, and trained 3 generations of snipers before retiring in 2015. But retirement didn't suit him. His wife had passed 2 years before, his kids lived across the country, and the silence in his small apartment felt heavier than any pack he'd ever carried. So when a recruiter mentioned they were testing a new program for older veterans wanting to re-enlist, Daniel walked into that office wearing his old red jacket and signed the papers. What nobody told him was that an administrative glitch had erased his entire service record from the system. As far as the Marine Corps computers were concerned, Daniel Hayes had never served a single day. The younger recruits had mocked him from day one. They called him Grandpa, Old Man, asked him if he needed help tying his boots. Daniel never responded. He just kept his head down, did his push-ups even when his shoulders screamed, ran the obstacle course even when his knees felt like broken glass. His expression never changed. That same sad, serious look that made him seem defeated even when he finished first in his age group. The drill instructors weren't much better. They treated him like a publicity stunt, feel-good story for the evening news, not a real Marine. They gave him the worst bunk, the heaviest gear, the longest watches. Daniel took it all without complaint. He'd learned a long time ago that some battles aren't worth fighting with words. Qualification day arrived with a cold wind cutting across the rifle range. Daniel stood in line with 19-year-olds who bounced on their toes with nervous energy. He simply waited, his white beard catching the early morning light, his red jacket zipped up against the chill. The drill instructor, a muscular man named Sergeant Vickers, who'd made it his personal mission to break the old man, walked down the line inspecting rifles. When he got to Daniel, he paused. He looked at the weapon in Daniel's hands, then back at his assistant, and Daniel saw something pass between them. A nod, a grin. Vickers moved on without a word, but Daniel felt the weight shift in his hands. The balance was wrong. The heft was off. He'd held enough rifles to know this one wasn't right. The first group moved to the firing line. Daniel watched them shoot, watched the targets pop up and down, watched the scores get called out. Some passed, some failed. Some would get another chance. When his group was called forward, Daniel moved to his assigned position. He knelt down, brought the rifle up. That's when he knew for certain. The moment he looked through the sights, the moment he felt the trigger pull, he understood what they'd done. This wasn't his rifle. This wasn't even a real rifle. Someone had swapped it for a pellet gun, a CO2-powered replica that looked identical but fired plastic BBs instead of rounds. He could hear the snickering behind him, could feel the eyes watching, waiting for him to complain, to cry foul, to prove he was just a foolish old man playing soldier. Daniel adjusted his position. He controlled his breathing the way he'd done 10,000 times before. The targets popped up at 50 yards, then 100, then 200. Each time Daniel fired, he heard that hollow pop instead of the sharp crack of gunpowder. Each time he compensated for the lighter projectile, the different trajectory, the way the wind caught the tiny plastic sphere. His face remained expressionless, sad and serious as he worked through the course. Behind him the laughter had started to fade. The recruits were looking at the spotters, confused. The spotters were looking at each other and at their scoring sheets, then back at the targets. Sergeant Vickers had stopped smiling. When the ceasefire was called, Daniel stood slowly, his knees protesting. He cleared the weapon, set it down, and waited. The range officer was on the radio, his voice sharp and confused. 2 spotters were jogging downrange to physically verify the targets. Sergeant Vickers was staring at Daniel like he'd just watched him walk on water. The other recruits had gone completely silent. Finally, the range officer walked over to Daniel, holding a scoring sheet in his hand. His face had gone pale. He looked at Daniel, then at the rifle on the ground, then back at Daniel. He asked if that was the weapon Daniel had been issued. Daniel confirmed it was. The range officer picked it up, examined it, and his jaw literally dropped open. The range officer's voice carried across the suddenly quiet firing line. He announced that Private Hayes had just scored a perfect 300, hitting every single target at every single distance, with what appeared to be a pellet gun. There was a moment of absolute silence, the kind that feels like the world has stopped spinning. Then Sergeant Vickers demanded to know how this had happened, who had switched the rifles, his face red with rage that wasn't directed at Daniel. 2 privates in the back suddenly found the ground very interesting. The range officer was already on the radio again, and within minutes a staff car was racing toward the range, kicking up dust. The car stopped. Colonel stepped out, a man in his 50s with ribbons covering his chest and an expression of barely contained fury. He walked straight to the range officer, listened to his report, then turned to look at Daniel. The old man stood at parade rest, his white hair ruffling in the wind, his red jacket dusty from kneeling on the range. The colonel stared at him for a long moment, then asked his name. Daniel responded clearly, his voice steady, despite the chaos around him. The colonel's eyes narrowed. He asked Daniel to repeat his full name and service number. Daniel did. The colonel pulled out his phone, hit a call, and everyone waited in tense silence. What happened next would become legend on that base. The colonel's face went from angry to shocked to something close to horrified. He ended the call and stood at attention. He called out for Sergeant Vickers, who jogged over immediately. The colonel's voice was ice as he asked who had authorized the rifle swap. Vickers stammered that it was meant as a joke, a prank to teach the old man a lesson about wasting the Corps' time. The colonel asked if Vickers knew who he was talking about. Vickers said it was just some old guy trying to relive his youth. The colonel's response cut through the air like a blade. He informed everyone present that they were standing in the presence of Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Hayes, retired, recipient of 2 Silver Stars, 1 Bronze Star with Valor Device, and holder of the Marine Corps record for longest confirmed kill in Operation Desert Storm. Colonel explained that Gunnery Sergeant Hayes had trained at this very base 43 years ago, had returned as an instructor for 20 years, and had personally trained over 200 scout snipers, including the colonel himself. An administrative error had wiped his records during a system upgrade, forcing him to re-enter as a recruit to correct the mistake. The colonel's voice shook with barely controlled anger as he said that, instead of being treated with the respect his service deserved, Gunnery Sergeant Hayes had been hazed, mocked, and sabotaged. And despite all of that, despite being given a toy instead of a weapon, he had just broken the base qualifying record by 50 points, with a pellet gun, at 200 yards. Sergeant Vickers looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. The 2 privates who'd switched the rifles were already being escorted away by MPs who'd arrived with the colonel. The other recruits stood frozen, many with tears in their eyes, realizing they'd spent weeks mocking a living legend. The colonel turned back to Daniel, and his entire demeanor changed. He asked permission to address him by his proper rank. Daniel, his expression still sad and serious, gave a small nod. The colonel called the entire range to attention and rendered a salute that every Marine present immediately mirrored. He stated that Gunnery Sergeant Hayes's records would be fully restored by the end of the day, that he would be offered any position he desired, and that the Marines who disrespected him would face appropriate consequences. Daniel returned the salute, his movements still crisp despite his age. He spoke quietly, saying he didn't want anyone punished too harshly. They were young, they didn't know, and he'd endured worse in actual combat. What he wanted, he said, was to finish what he'd started. He wanted to complete the training, not because he needed to prove anything, but because he'd signed up to serve again, and he intended to keep that promise. The colonel looked at him with something close to awe, and agreed immediately, he added, that from that moment forward, Gunnery Sergeant Hayes would be treated with the respect his rank and service demanded. He also mentioned that the pellet gun Daniel had used would be mounted in the base museum with a plaque describing what he'd accomplished with it. The rest of Daniel's time at that base became the stuff of legend. The young recruits who'd mocked him now sought his advice, listened to his stories, treated him like the mentor he'd always been. Sergeant Vickers personally apologized, and Daniel accepted it with the same quiet dignity he'd shown through everything else. The two privates who'd switched the rifles were given extra duty, but not discharged, at Daniel's request. He spent time with them, explaining that pranks were part of military culture, but cruelty never was, and that the difference mattered. They both later requested assignment to sniper school, inspired by the man they'd tried to humiliate. When Daniel finally graduated, properly recognized and restored to his correct rank, the ceremony was attended by Marines from across the country, many of whom he'd trained decades before. They came to honor the man who'd shown that respect isn't about age or appearance, that skill doesn't fade with time, and that true Marines never stop being Marines no matter what obstacles are placed in their path. The base commander presented Daniel with the mounted pellet gun and told the assembled crowd that it would serve as a permanent reminder that assumptions are dangerous, that every person deserves dignity, and that some men are forged from something stronger than steel. Daniel Hayes continued to serve for another 3 years, training a new generation of snipers and mentoring young Marines who needed guidance. He never raised his voice, never sought recognition, never lost that sad, serious expression that had become his trademark. But everyone who met him understood that beneath the white hair and the worn red jacket was a man who embodied everything the Marines stood for. When he finally retired for good at 71, his ceremony was attended by a general who'd been a private in one of his first classes. The general said that Daniel had taught them all that honor isn't given, it's lived, and that the measure of a Marine isn't in their youth or strength, but in their character and dedication. The pellet gun still hangs in that base museum today, with a plaque that tells the story of the day. An old man in a red jacket broke every record with a toy rifle and reminded an entire base what it means to be a Marine. Recruits stop to read it, to touch the worn stock, to remember that respect is earned through action, and that judging someone by their appearance is the fastest way to miss greatness standing right in front of you.